The text message came from a number I didn't recognize. At 7:14 on the morning of my brother's wedding day, while I was curling my hair in the upstairs bathroom with my bridesmaid dress already zipped and my heels waiting on the floor. "Don't go to the wedding," it said. "Check your husband's garage first." I laughed. I genuinely laughed, the short, dismissive laugh of a woman who is running 20 minutes behind schedule and has no patience for whatever this was. I put the phone face down on the counter and finished my hair. I should have put down the curling iron instead, because what was in that garage? Behind the locked door my husband had been telling me for 8 months held nothing but his woodworking equipment, was the reason my marriage ended, the reason 2 other people's lives collapsed, and the reason I spent a Saturday afternoon in October understanding that almost everything I'd believed about the last 3 years had been constructed specifically to keep me from knowing the truth. But none of that is where the story starts. The story starts earlier, in the house on Sycamore Creek Road, in the life I had built and believed in and defended past the point where defending it made any sense at all. My name is Jenna Harlow. Jenna Marsh before I married Cole, and Jenna Marsh again now, reclaimed at the courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon with a feeling I can only describe as the specific relief of putting on a coat you'd forgotten you owned and discovering it still fits perfectly. I was 34 years old when everything came apart. Living in a 4-bedroom house in Knoxville, Tennessee, that Cole and I had bought together 3 years into our marriage, and working as a speech-language pathologist at a pediatric rehabilitation center where the work was demanding and specific and consistently, reliably meaningful in a way that anchored me through years when other things were less stable than I knew. I had a good life, in the concrete sense of the phrase, work I was good at, a house I'd made into something, a brother named Davis who was getting married that Saturday in October, and whose fiancée Meg I liked with the particular affection you develop for someone who is making your family larger in a good way. I had what looked, from any reasonable distance, like exactly what I'd wanted. Cole Harlow was 37, a contractor who ran his own residential renovation business with 4 employees and a client base that had grown steadily over the 6 years we'd been together. He was the kind of man who built things, not just professionally, but as a personality, as an instinct, and who had a specific physical ease in spaces that needed work, a way of looking at a room and understanding what it required before he'd said a word about it. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, with hands that were always slightly rough from work, and a specific kind of patience with physical problems that he did not always extend to emotional ones, which was a thing I'd noticed and accommodated over 6 years, without fully examining what the accommodation was costing me. He had a woodworking shop in our attached garage, a serious setup, with a workbench and a table saw and a dust collection system, and tools organized on pegboards the way tools are organized by someone who treats them as extensions of his professional identity. The garage had been his domain for as long as we'd lived in the house. I had no reason to go in there. Nothing of mine was stored there. And Cole had what I'd understood as a craftsman's preference for his workspace being his workspace. Not locked against me, exactly, but clearly not a shared space. Clearly not somewhere I was expected to wander. I had respected this the way I respected most of his preferences, which is to say, without thinking much about it, because there was no obvious reason to think about it, and because I had enough of my own domains that requiring equal access to his had never seemed like something worth raising. The garage door had been fitted with a new padlock in February, 8 months before the wedding. Cole had mentioned it the same evening he installed it, casually, over dinner, in the register of someone conveying a minor logistical update. "Put a new lock on the shop," he said. "The old one was getting sticky." I'd said, okay. I hadn't asked to see the new key. He hadn't offered it. The padlock was a master lock, the heavy kind with a brass body that resisted cutting. and it had a specific sound when it was engaged, a definitive click that I'd come to associate with the door being secured at the end of his workdays. I heard that sound most evenings from inside the house, and thought nothing of it for 8 months, because the sound of a lock engaging on a workshop door is one of the most unremarkable sounds in a homeowner's life. I had heard it become something else entirely, and then I had put it back in the category of unremarkable over and over, because I was not yet ready to let it mean what it meant. Our mornings had the specific texture of a life that has been shared long enough to develop its own grammar. Cole was up at 5:30 most days, coffee already made by the time I came downstairs at 6:15, 2 cups on the counter with the proportions he'd learned from years of watching me make mine. I drank my coffee standing at the kitchen island, reviewing my caseload notes on my tablet while Cole ate breakfast at the table and scrolled whatever construction forum or hardware catalog had his attention that morning. We talked in the comfortable, abbreviated way of people who have been talking to each other every morning for years. Shorthand, mostly, the conversational equivalent of a familiar route. He kissed me on the side of the head before he left at 6:45. The same spot, the same brief press of lips that had become as automatic as the coffee cups. Our dogs, 2 beagles named Huck and Sawyer, named by Cole because he'd been in a Twain phase when we got them, started demanding breakfast approximately 40 minutes before it was time for breakfast every morning, which was a reliable alarm system and a reliable source of low-stakes domestic comedy. I left at 7:30. The mornings worked. They had always worked. I had confused working with good for longer than I should have. The garage padlock had been preceded by something I hadn't connected to it at the time and should have. A new phone. Cole had gotten a new work phone in January, a week before the padlock, and had made a point of keeping the 2 devices separate in a way that was slightly more deliberate than his previous practice. He'd always been someone who kept his work life and personal life on different organizational tracks, different email accounts, different calendars, the particular compartmentalization of a contractor whose client communications needed to be accessible and retrievable. And so the second phone hadn't registered as anything except an extension of that existing pattern. He kept it charged on the kitchen counter during evenings and took it with him in the morning. And if it rang while he was home, he sometimes stepped outside to take the call, which he'd always done with work calls because the dogs made noise, and he didn't want the background interference on client conversations. I had accepted all of this as consistent with what I already knew about him. Every piece of the pattern was explainable individually. It was only together, in retrospect, with everything else I would later learn, that the individual pieces composed a picture I'd refused to see. Davis's wedding was the last Saturday in October, at a vineyard outside Knoxville called Ridgeline Estate, an hour's drive from our house. Meg's family had done the planning, which was elaborate and beautiful in the way of weddings where the people getting married are genuinely happy and the people around them are glad about it. The specific warmth of an occasion that earns its formality. I was a bridesmaid, along with Meg's sister and 2 of her college friends, and I'd been involved in the planning at the level my brother's impending marriage warranted. Present at the engagement party, helpful at the dress shopping, a phone call away for logistical questions, and genuinely invested in the outcome because Davis and Meg were good together in the most fundamental way, and I had been looking forward to the wedding for months. Cole was not a groomsman. Davis had used 2 college friends for that, but he was attending as my husband, seated at my table, and we'd been planning to drive together and arrive at noon for the 1 o'clock ceremony. The morning of the wedding was the text message. I laughed and put the phone down and finished my hair and went to the kitchen for coffee, and found Cole already dressed in his wedding clothes, charcoal suit, the blue tie I'd picked, sitting at the kitchen table with his work phone in his hand and his personal phone on the counter. He looked up when I came in with the particular expression he had when he was managing something internal and not entirely succeeding at it. And he said, "You look beautiful." I said thank you and poured coffee. Huck put his head on my foot, which he did when he sensed that something needed acknowledging. I should have paid more attention to the dog. "You still good to leave at 11:30? I asked. More attention. "Yeah," Cole said, and went back to his work phone. I drank my coffee and thought about the text. And then I thought about it again. And then I picked up my phone and read it a second time. "Don't go to the wedding. Check your husband's garage first." The number was at 865 area code, Knoxville local, and it was not in my contacts. I showed it to Cole because it was a strange thing to receive, and I had no category for it, and Cole was sitting right there. I held the phone toward him and said, "Did you see anything like this?" He looked at it. Something happened in his face. The specific thing that happens when a person receives a piece of information that they were not expecting and that is immediately threatening. A rapid internal mobilization that shows briefly at the surface before being controlled. He controlled it in about 2 seconds. He said, "Probably a prank. Ignore it." He said it with the specific authority of a man who has already decided what the answer is. I looked at the text. I looked at my husband. I put the phone in my purse. But the text had planted something that I didn't have a name for yet. A low, persistent vibration at the base of my thinking. The way a sound you can't quite identify keeps pulling your attention back to it, even when you've decided it's nothing. We drove to the vineyard, and the ceremony was everything a ceremony at Ridgeline Estate in October should be. The vines going gold and amber on the hillside. Meg walking toward my brother with the specific face of a woman who has decided completely and is joyful about it. Davis standing at the altar with an expression I hadn't seen on him since we were children. Open and unguarded and full. I stood with the other bridesmaids, and I watched my brother get married. And I felt the thing you feel when something good and real happens in your family. The specific warmth of it. And I reached for Cole's hand during the vows, and he took it and held it. And underneath all of it, underneath the ceremony and the reception and the toasts and the dancing, the vibration was still there. I picked up my phone 3 times during the reception and looked at the text. Check your husband's garage. The number hadn't texted again. Whoever had sent it had sent one message and gone quiet, which was more unsettling somehow than if they'd followed up. At the reception, between the dinner and the dancing, I went to the restroom and I took the unknown number out of my contacts and called it. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The voicemail was a generic, automated greeting. No name, just a number. I hung up without leaving a message. I stood in the restroom of the Ridgeline Estate venue with my bridesmaid dress and my updo and my phone in my hand, and I looked at my own face in the mirror above the sink, and I made a decision that I framed to myself as a practical one. I was going to go home before Cole tonight, and I was going to look in the garage, and I was either going to find woodworking equipment and feel slightly foolish, or I was going to find something else and know what to do with it. I was done choosing not to look. The opportunity came at 10:30, when the dancing was well underway, and Cole was at the bar with Davis's college friends, deep in the kind of conversation that happens between men at open bars, and that would sustain itself without his attention for at least another 40 minutes. I found my mother at the edge of the dance floor and said I had a headache, which was not entirely false. The vibration had become something more specific and physical over the course of the evening, and I was going to slip out, and she would tell Davis and Meg I loved them, and I'd call them tomorrow. My mother looked at me with the specific look she has when she's deciding whether to say something, and then she said, "Is everything all right?" I said yes, just tired." She held my gaze for one extra second and then said, "Okay, sweetheart," and hugged me, and I walked out to the parking lot and got in my car and drove home. The drive home was 47 minutes. I know the exact duration because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way, measuring something I couldn't have named precisely. The October dark came through the windshield, and the headlights cut through it, and I kept both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 the way my father had taught me. And I thought about the padlock installed in February and the new work phone in January, and the evenings Cole had spent in the garage over the past 8 months. More evenings than previously, I realized, reconstructing it now with the specific attention of someone who has started counting things they'd previously let pass uncounted. He'd been in the garage more, much more. 3, 4 evenings a week for the past several months, staying in there until 9 or 10 at night, coming inside smelling of sawdust and wood stain, showing me occasional pieces, a small side table, a cutting board, a frame, that I'd admired and put in the category of productive hobby. I had been seeing the outputs and not asking about the process. I was about to ask about the process. Our house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, which meant Cole was still at the vineyard, which was what I'd expected. I went inside, changed out of my bridesmaid dress and heels into jeans and sneakers, and then I stood in the kitchen for a moment with my hands on the island counter, looking at the door that led to the attached garage. The door from the inside of the house didn't require the padlock. The padlock was on the exterior garage door, the one that opened to the driveway. The interior door was just a standard door with a standard handle, and I had never been prohibited from using it. I opened it. The garage smell hit me immediately. Sawdust, the mineral bite of wood stain, the familiar smell of the shop I'd been adjacent to for years without being inside it. I reached for the light switch on the right side of the door frame and found it and flipped it. The workbench was still there. The pegboards with the tools, still organized with Cole's characteristic precision. The table saw, the router table, the dust collection system, everything I expected. I stepped inside and I looked around, and for approximately 8 seconds, I felt the specific deflation of a person who has made themselves anxious over nothing. And then I saw the back corner. The back corner of the garage, behind the table saw, had always held lumber storage, a rack of pine and oak boards in various dimensions, organized by size. The lumber rack was still there, but in front of it, partially obscured by the table saw unless you stepped past it and looked behind, was something that had not been there before. 2 large plastic storage bins, the kind with locking lids and wheels, dark green, stacked one on the other. And beside them, on a small rolling cart I'd never seen before, a laptop in a padded case, a portable Wi-Fi router still plugged into an extension cord that ran along the baseboard to the nearest outlet, and a stack of what appeared to be printed documents held together with binder clips. I stood in the garage with the overhead fluorescent light humming above me and looked at this arrangement, and the specific quality of it, the hidden placement, the portable equipment, the deliberate organization of a secondary workspace that had no reason to exist in my garage, registered in my body before it registered in my mind, as a cold, spreading sensation that moved from my sternum outward to my fingertips and left them numb. I went to the cart. I picked up the top document in the stack, the one on the outside of the binder-clipped set, and I looked at it. It was a purchase agreement. The property address was on Hillside Drive in the Bearden neighborhood of Knoxville, a street I knew peripherally. The buyer name listed was Harlow Custom Properties, LLC. The seller was a family I didn't recognize. The closing date was 6 weeks ago. The purchase price was $462,000. I read the document twice, standing at the rolling cart in my husband's garage in my jeans and sneakers at 11 o'clock on the night of my brother's wedding. and then I read it a third time, and the number at the bottom, $462,000, sat in my vision like a weight that I couldn't lift and couldn't ignore. Harlow Custom Properties, LLC. Not Cole Harlow, contractor. Not a business name I recognized or had heard or had any reason to know existed, because the business I knew about, the renovation business with 4 employees and a client base, was called Cole Harlow Construction, and this was something else. Something registered separately, something with its own name, its own purchase agreements, its own hidden operational center in the back corner of my garage. My hands were not shaking. This registered as strange to me, the steadiness in the face of what I was looking at. And then I understood it as the specific steadiness of a person whose body has been preparing for this for a long time. The steadiness of something that has finally been confirmed rather than something that has arrived without warning. I had been warned. In February, in January, in the text I'd dismissed that morning. My body had known before my mind had allowed the knowledge. I photographed everything. The purchase agreement, every page. The other documents in the stack, there were 11 additional sets, each with a different property address, each with Harlow Custom Properties as the buyer, spanning dates going back 2 years. 2 years. Spanning 19 months of property purchases in a business I didn't know existed, using what I would later learn was a combination of funds drawn from our joint home equity line of credit and revenue from cash payments on renovation projects that had never appeared in Cole's reported business income. I photographed the laptop case, the router, the bins. I didn't open the bins. I needed to leave everything as I'd found it, and I already had more than I knew what to do with. I took 47 photographs in 11 minutes, working with the systematic efficiency of someone who understands that the window of opportunity is finite and that every image might matter later. Then I went back into the house, closed the garage door behind me, sat down at the kitchen table, and called my friend Nora. Nora Castillo had been my closest friend for 8 years, since we'd been in the same cohort in graduate school, and she had the specific quality that the best friends have. She answered at 11:15 on a Saturday night with the voice of someone who had been awake anyway and was ready to be useful. I told her in 7 minutes what I'd found. She was quiet for the specific 2 seconds she was always quiet before she said anything important. And then she said, "You need a family law attorney and a financial forensics person, and you need both of them before Cole gets home tonight." I said I didn't know how to get either at 11:15 on a Saturday. She said, "I do. My cousin Diane is a family law attorney in Knoxville. She's good, and she owes me 3 favors. I'm going to call her right now. You go through those photographs and organize them by date. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. She hung up. I organized the photographs by date. She called back in 9 minutes. Diane Schultz was available Monday morning at 8 o'clock, which was the earliest possible opening for something that was going to require her full attention rather than a quick call. And in the meantime, Nora had spoken to her long enough to relay one piece of immediate advice. Do not tell Cole what I'd found. Do not remove anything from the garage, and get the home equity line of credit statement from the joint account before Monday, if I could access it online. I pulled up the joint account on my laptop and found the HELOC statements. The available credit was $63,000 less than it should have been. The withdrawals were in amounts below the threshold that triggered automatic notification. Never more than $9,000 at a time, spaced 3 to 4 weeks apart, going back 16 months. Specific, deliberate, precisely calibrated to avoid the automated alerts that Cole knew about, because he was the one who had set up the joint account's notification parameters. I photographed the screen with my phone. I saved the screenshots. I sent everything to myself at a personal email address that Cole didn't have access to, and that I'd been using for patient-related professional communications for years. because I was not going to have this information only in places that Cole could reach. He came home at 12:45. I was in bed, not asleep, but in bed, in the dark, with the specific, controlled stillness of someone who has made a decision and is holding it while they wait. I heard his car in the driveway, heard the front door, heard him moving through the house with the quiet care of someone who believes his wife is asleep and is trying not to wake her. He checked the garage door. I heard the interior door open and close in the pause between the kitchen and the bedroom hallway. A brief, confirmatory check that sounded exactly like what it was. A man verifying that his hidden office is still hidden. Then he came to bed. He lay down beside me in the dark, and within 15 minutes was breathing the even, unremarkable breath of a man who has nothing pressing on his conscience. I lay beside him, and I stared at the ceiling, and I did not sleep. And by 5 in the morning I had gone through everything I knew and assembled it into a structure I could present to Diane Schultz on Monday. And somewhere between 4 and 5 I had crossed from frightened into something else. Something cold and purposeful. And, if I'm being honest, finally, genuinely awake. Sunday was the longest day I have spent in my adult life. Cole and I had breakfast, and he asked how the wedding had gone after I'd left. And I told him Davis and Meg were wonderful, and the venue was beautiful, which was true. And he said, good, and went to the garage at 9 and came out at noon for lunch, and went back in at 1. I did my laundry. I called my mother and said the wedding had been perfect. I took Huck and Sawyer for a walk around the block and stood at the end of the street looking at my own house from the outside. The 4-bedroom colonial, the attached garage with its new padlock, the garden I'd planted in the spring that was still producing the last of the fall herbs. And I thought about 16 months of HELOC withdrawals and 12 separate property purchases, and the rolling cart with the laptop and the router, and the neatly organized documents. I thought about the name Harlow Custom Properties, LLC, which used our last name, my last name, for another month, as though the business we were supposedly building together was somehow represented in it, when in fact it was a separate entity that I had not known existed and that had been funded in part by equity from our shared home. I thought about the text message, and who had sent it, and what they knew and why they'd told me. I went back inside and made lunch, and called Davis to congratulate him, and told him the ceremony was beautiful. I held all of this inside me for one complete day, without letting any of it show in my face or my voice or the way I moved through the house. And by Sunday night, I understood that the capacity I'd always had for managing difficult things without apparent distress was not, as I'd sometimes worried, emotional unavailability. It was, in fact, exactly the skill this moment required. It was Monday morning at 8 o'clock. I was in Diane Schultz's office with my phone full of photographs and my laptop with the bank statements and a yellow legal pad I'd filled Sunday night in the small hours with everything I could reconstruct about the timeline. The January phone, the February padlock, the first HELOC withdrawal I could identify, the approximate dates of the garage renovation from a general living space to a secondary office. Diane was 46, with the direct, unhurried manner of someone who has heard complicated things and is not going to pretend yours is simple when it isn't. She went through everything with me for 90 minutes, asking questions in a sequence that told me she was building the legal structure of the situation as we talked, and at the end of 90 minutes she said, "This is financial fraud within a marriage. The HELOC withdrawals are marital asset diversion fraud. The LLC is a vehicle for hiding business income and real estate acquisitions that should be disclosed as marital property."
She paused.
The properties, 12 of them, over 2 years. If they've been renovated and are generating rental income, that income is also marital property, regardless of how the LLC is structured, because the funding came from marital assets.
She looked at me across her desk.
This is not a simple divorce. This is a forensic accounting case attached to a divorce, and we need to start the forensic process before he knows we're doing it.
She said.
Can you stay this morning? I want to get some calls made.
I stayed. While Diane called a forensic accountant named Harold Webb, who she used regularly, and who was available to begin preliminary document analysis that week, I sat in the chair across from her desk, and I thought about something. I thought about who had sent the text message. Don't go to the wedding. Check your husband's garage first.
Someone knew about the garage. Someone who was either a current or former client, a business associate, a neighbor, or, and this was the possibility that had been pressing against the edges of my thoughts since Saturday morning, someone who had a more specific stake in my husband's activities becoming known. I said this to Diane, who nodded and said, "It matters. If there's someone with first-hand knowledge who's willing to talk, that's a significant asset. Can you find out who it was?" I said I was going to try. I called the number again from the parking lot outside Diane's office. This time, it answered on the second ring. The voice was a woman's, young, mid to late 20s, with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for this call and has already decided what she's going to say. She said, "I figured you'd call eventually." I said, "Who are you?" She said her name was Kelsey Briggs, and she said it the way people say things when they've been holding them for a while and are relieved to finally put them down. She said she'd been working as a property manager for Harlow Custom Properties for 14 months, managing 3 of the rental properties. She said she'd been paid in cash, off the books, by Cole. She said she'd sent me the text message because 3 days earlier, Cole had told her the properties were being restructured and her arrangement was ending, and she'd calculated, correctly as it turned out, that whatever restructuring was coming was not going to be in her favor if she didn't create some insurance for herself first. She said she had documentation of all 14 months of her employment, texts from Cole with instructions, photographs of the properties, records of the cash payments she'd received. She said she was willing to provide everything she had to my attorney if it helped establish the full picture of the business's operations. She said all of this in approximately 4 minutes, with the efficient, slightly resigned tone of someone who has made their decision and is past the anxiety of it. I said, "Can you come to my attorney's office today?" She said yes. Kelsey Briggs came to Diane's office at 2 o'clock and sat across from Diane and me with a folder of documents that had been assembled, I noticed, with a specific care that suggested she'd been preparing it for at least a few days. Organized by property, by date, with her own handwritten summary notes at the front of each section. She was 28, with light brown hair and the particular composure of a young woman who has been in an uncomfortable situation for a long time, and has decided that the most important thing now is to be credible and precise. She laid out 14 months of the Harlow Custom Properties operation in 45 minutes. The 3 properties she'd managed, the cash payment system, the tenant communications she'd handled, the maintenance contractors Cole had paid through the business, and, the piece that Diane noted with a specific increase in attention, the name of the accountant who had set up the LLC and was managing its books. The accountant's name was Ray Deaton, who was not the same accountant Cole used for Cole Harlow Construction, but a separate person, hired specifically for the separate business. Diane wrote the name down and circled it twice. I want to tell you about the second layer, because the second layer arrived 4 days later, and it was worse than the first. Harold Webb, the forensic accountant, had been working through the Harlow Custom Properties documents that Kelsey had provided, and that Diane had subpoenaed the business records to supplement. And on Thursday afternoon, he called Diane with preliminary findings. Diane called me immediately after, and her voice had the controlled, careful quality it got when she was managing news that was worse than expected. The 12 properties in the LLC were not just a hidden business venture. 9 of the 12 had been purchased at below-market prices through a relationship with a real estate wholesaler named Greg Thorne, who was receiving a percentage of the below-market purchase discount as a kickback arrangement, which was not illegal in itself, but which had been financed using HELOC withdrawals that were documented as home improvement loans on our joint application, meaning Cole had committed bank fraud in the process of funding the purchases. 2 of the 12 properties had been used as collateral for a business loan of $220,000 that Cole had taken out through the LLC 6 months ago. The loan was in default. The properties were at risk of foreclosure, and the bank that held the business loan, a community bank in West Knoxville, had been attempting to contact the owner of Harlow Custom Properties LLC at the business address listed in the LLC documents, which was our house. The notices had been going to an email address I'd never seen, on a domain registered to the LLC. Cole had been receiving legal correspondence about a $220,000 defaulted business loan at our home address through an email he'd kept me completely unaware of for 6 months. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my rehabilitation center after Diane's call. I'd taken the call on my lunch break, which meant I had 12 minutes before my first afternoon patient. And I pressed my back against the seat, and I breathed. 4 counts in and 4 counts out. The way I teach children to manage their nervous systems when the world becomes too much. The October sun was low and direct through the windshield. My hands were in my lap, completely still. I thought about the loan in default, and the foreclosure risk, and the $220,000. And I thought about the equity in our house that was simultaneously being used as collateral for our joint HELOC. The same house. If the LLC properties went to foreclosure and the bank came after personal assets, our house was in the line of fire. The house that was in both our names. The house where I lived. I called Diane back and left a message. We needed to move faster. She called back in 10 minutes and said, I know. The filing would happen tomorrow. Cole came home Thursday evening to find the divorce papers on the kitchen table, which is not how I had intended to deliver them. I had intended to let the process server handle it, but my attorney had expedited the filing and the process server had appeared at our door at 4:30 while I was still at work, and Cole had been home, and he had signed for the service because he'd thought it was a package. So when I came home at 5:45, Cole was sitting at the kitchen table with the divorce petition in front of him, and his face, when I walked through the door, had the specific expression of a man who has just understood something that rearranges everything he thought he knew about the current situation. He was very still. Huck was under the table with his head on Cole's foot, which Huck did when he sensed distress. And Sawyer was in his bed in the corner, watching the room with the alert attention of a dog who knows something is happening and hasn't decided yet whether to be worried about it. The kitchen smelled of the chicken I'd put in the slow cooker that morning, which seemed impossibly domestic given what was on the table between us. I set my bag on the counter. I poured myself a glass of water. I turned around and looked at my husband sitting at our kitchen table with a divorce petition in front of him. And I waited. You filed, he said. The words came out flat, stripped of the performance they might have had if he'd had more time to prepare. I filed, I said. He looked at the petition. He looked at me. His jaw moved. How long have you known? Looked at me, he asked. And in the question, I heard the calculation. How long had I known? What did I know specifically? How much had I found? And how much time did that give him? Long enough, I said. My attorney has the full picture, Cole. The LLC, the properties, the HELOC withdrawals, the business loan in default, Ray Deaton, Greg Thorne, Kelsey Briggs. I said the names the way you lay out cards, one at a time, watching the face across from you. At Kelsey's name, Something moved through Cole that was sharper than what the other names had produced. A brief, vivid response that came and went before he could control it. "Kelsey," he started. "Kelsey provided documentation," I said, with the same quietness I'd been maintaining since Saturday night. 14 months of it. Your attorney will have copies tomorrow." The kitchen was very quiet. The slow cooker made its small, steady sound. Huck pressed closer to Cole's foot under the table. A dog loyalty that Cole hadn't earned, but that Huck was incapable of withdrawing. I watched my husband sit with what I'd just laid out, and I felt none of the anger I might have expected to feel. I was past the anger. I'd processed it somewhere between Sunday night and Monday morning in Diane's office. And what had replaced it was the clear, specific feeling of something being over. "The bank is going to come after the house," Cole said. His voice had changed, the performance entirely gone now, replaced with something that was almost, if not quite, honest. "The LLC loan. I'm trying to work it out with them, but if the foreclosures go through..." "My attorney has filed a motion to protect my interest in the marital home during the proceeding," I said. "The marital home is jointly owned. Your LLC's business loan has no claim on my share of it." I paused. "We should let our attorneys talk about the rest." Cole looked at the petition on the table. He looked at me. He put both hands flat on the table and then he said, in a voice that had the specific texture of a person who has run out of positions, "I'm sorry, Jenna." I heard the apology land and pass through me without catching. "I know that doesn't..." He stopped, started again. "I kept thinking I'd fix it before you found out. The loan, the properties. I thought if I could just..." He stopped again, because the sentence had nowhere to go that made the rest of it better. "I know," I said. "That's how it works. You keep thinking you'll fix it. And then someone texts your wife on the morning of her brother's wedding." I looked at him steadily. "Kelsey saved both of us, actually. If the foreclosures had proceeded without me knowing about the LLC, I'd have lost my share of this house without understanding why." A pause. "You should thank her." I did. I picked up my bag. I took my glass of water and went upstairs. And behind me, I heard Cole sit at the kitchen table, in the silence of a man who is starting to understand the actual dimensions of what he's built. The public confrontation arrived the following Monday, unexpectedly, in the form of a call from Cole's mother, Patricia, who had apparently been informed of the divorce filing by Cole over the weekend, and who arrived at my workplace, the rehabilitation center, my place of work, where I was in the middle of a patient session, demanding to speak with me. The front desk paged me, and I finished my session and came to the waiting room to find Patricia Harlow standing at the front desk with the contained fury of a woman who has decided that intervention is necessary and has not stopped to consider whether it was invited. She was 61, with Cole's coloring and a fraction of his patience, and she had always had the specific quality of a mother-in-law who believes her son's success is her success, and therefore his difficulties are also hers to manage. "I need to speak with you privately," she said, with the tone of someone who has been issuing directives for long enough that they no longer expect resistance. I looked at her. I looked at the waiting room, which held 2 families with children waiting for appointments and a colleague finishing notes at the front desk, all of whom had gone very still in the way that people go still when they sense that a scene is either happening or about to. "This isn't an appropriate place," I said. "Then step outside," she said, with the same tone. I stepped outside. Patricia followed. She said, "We stood on the sidewalk in front of the rehabilitation center in the October cold, and she said, with the compressed urgency of someone delivering a prepared speech, 'Cole made mistakes. I know that. But what you're doing, going to some lawyer, making this public, the financial accusations, This is going to destroy his business, his reputation, everything he's built. You have been his wife for 6 years. You owe him the chance to fix this before I what? I said. The words came out with a quietness that stopped her mid-sentence. She looked at me. Before you file papers that go on record. Before you bring attorneys and accountants into something that is a private family matter. I looked at Patricia Harlow, who had sat at my Thanksgiving table for 6 years and called me her daughter-in-law with the specific warmth of someone who meant it, and I said, "There is $63,000 missing from our home equity line of credit. There is a $220,000 business loan in default, secured against properties purchased with money from our joint home. There are 12 properties I didn't know existed. That is not a private family matter. That is a financial crime that involves my name on a mortgage, and I am going to protect myself from it with every tool I legally have." I paused. This conversation isn't something I'm going to have again. I looked at her for one more second, and then I went back inside, and the colleague at the front desk caught my eye as I passed and gave me a very small, very specific nod that meant, "I heard that, and you were right, and good for you." The third confrontation happened at the house, on a Saturday 3 weeks after the filing, when Cole came to collect some of his things with a moving truck that was larger than the conversation we'd had about what he was taking. He'd brought his brother Kevin with him, which I understood as a choice to have a witness rather than a choice to have help. And Kevin had always been someone I'd had a cordial rather than a warm relationship with. We were polite. We were functional at family gatherings. We had nothing specific against each other, but also nothing that had developed into actual friendship. Kevin stood in the driveway while Cole went through the house, and I stood in the kitchen with Nora, who had come to be present at my request, and whose presence Cole had noted with the slight recalibration of a man who had expected a different configuration of the room. Cole came through the kitchen with a box of his tools and stopped when he saw what was on the counter. An envelope, addressed to him in my handwriting, with the notation, "Re. Harlow Custom Properties, Key," written on the front. He set down the box. He picked up the envelope. He opened it and looked at what was inside. The envelope contained the padlock key I'd found in the garage, the key to the master lock that had been installed in February, the key he'd never offered me a copy of. I had removed it from the hook in the utility closet the night I'd decided to be done, and I'd put it in this envelope, and I'd written his name on the front, and I'd left it on the counter where he would find it. "Your garage," I said, rovnym голосом, от которого стало холодно, "is no longer in my house. Take everything in it when you go." Kevin, in the doorway, looked at the floor. Nora, beside me, said nothing. Cole stood with the padlock key in his hand, and the envelope, and the knowledge of everything the key represented. And he said nothing for a long time. And in that long silence, I heard the full accounting of 6 years and 1 garage padlock, and 12 properties, and $63,000, and 1 text message from a woman named Kelsey Briggs, who had, in the end, done me the most significant favor of my adult life. The legal process took 6 months. Harold Webb's forensic accounting established the full scope of the Harlow Custom Properties operation, which totaled, across all 12 properties and the LLC's 18 months of operation, gross revenues of approximately $800,000, of which a court-determined marital share, calculated based on the proportion of marital assets used to fund the LLC, was awarded to me in the settlement assets. The defaulted business loan was resolved through a restructuring that Cole negotiated separately with the bank, which did not affect the marital home because Diane's early protective filing had been effective and my interest in the property was shielded. The HELOC withdrawals were characterized as marital asset diversion, and were included in the settlement calculation. Cole Harlow Construction, the legitimate business, the one with 4 employees and a real client base, survived the divorce, which I was told by Diane had been important to Cole, and which I had no particular investment in either preventing or protecting beyond my legal entitlement to my share of its marital value, which was included. The settlement was finalized in April. I signed my copy at Diane's office on a Thursday morning, and Diane walked me to my car afterward, which she didn't usually do, and said, "You handled this very well." I said, "I had good help." She said, "You also had good instincts." I thought about the text message and the curling iron and the bridesmaid dress and said, "I had a helpful stranger." Kelsey Briggs had been paid fairly for her role as a material witness in the form of a release from any employment-related liability, which Diane had structured cleanly and which Kelsey had accepted and moved on from. She'd gotten a property management job at a legitimate firm in early November, 2 weeks after the filing, and I heard from Diane that she was doing well in it. I thought about Kelsey Briggs occasionally, in the months after everything settled, the specific calculations she must have made, the risk she'd taken, the single text message she'd sent, and the one call she'd answered, the folder of documents assembled with the careful organization of someone who knew she was going to need to be credible. She had done the right thing in a complicated situation, for complicated reasons, and the outcome had been what she'd calculated it might be. And I was not going to reduce that to a simple story about motivation, when the actual story was more interesting and more human than that. 7 months after the settlement, on a morning in November, I drove past the house on Sycamore Creek Road for the first time since the day I'd moved out. I was in my car, heading to a Saturday appointment, and I took the route that went past the old street, and I slowed as I came by it. The Colonial was there, exactly as it had been. The fall garden gone to its winter dormancy, the attached garage with its exterior door closed, the driveway with a different car in it. Someone else lived there now. The new owners had painted the front door a dark green, which I found myself appreciating from a purely aesthetic standpoint. The painter's eye that had always been mine independent of the house. The neighborhood was the same. The street was the same. The house was the same house it had always been, and it was simply no longer mine, which was a fact that I held for the length of a traffic light and then released and drove on. I lived now in a 2-bedroom apartment in the 4th and Gill neighborhood, a 15-minute drive from the rehabilitation center with Huck and Sawyer. I had asked for the dogs in the settlement and gotten them without any negotiation because Cole had not contested it, which had been the one piece of the process that proceeded without friction. The apartment had 2 south-facing windows in the living room that got excellent afternoon light, and I had furnished it slowly and deliberately over the months of unpacking a new life, choosing each piece with the specific attention of someone who is making a space entirely and only for herself for the first time in years. The kitchen was small but efficient. The bedroom window looked out over a backyard shared by the building's tenants, where a neighbor's maple tree had gone spectacular gold in the October of my first year there. I made coffee every morning with a method I'd chosen myself, from beans I'd chosen myself, in a kitchen that smelled like nobody's habits except mine. Davis called on a Sunday morning in December, 7 months after his wedding, in his usual Sunday call pattern that had been established when we were both in our 20s, and that had survived geography and marriages and everything else. He asked how I was, genuinely, with the specific quality of inquiry that older siblings sometimes develop when their younger siblings have been through something difficult. Not protective exactly, more like attentive, like someone who has made a decision to pay better attention and is honoring it. I told him I was good. He said, "You sound like yourself." I said, "I am." He said, "Good." Meg says she wants you to come for Christmas. I said I'd come for Christmas. The padlock was gone. Cole had taken it when he'd taken everything from the garage, including the rolling cart with the laptop and the router and the organized documents. All of it cleared out in one afternoon with his brother Kevin helping, and the moving truck backed into the driveway. What I had kept from the whole of Sycamore Creek Road was not much. My own things, my professional materials, the dogs, and one small object I'd taken from the kitchen the morning I moved out. It was a keychain I'd had since before I met Cole. A simple silver disc with the initials J.M. stamped into it, given to me by my mother when I got my first car at 16. J for Jenna, and M for Marsh, which were my initials then, and my initials again now. I'd used it through the marriage with Cole's keys on it, my name on the disc every day in a combination I'd stopped noticing on it. When I moved out, I took Cole's keys off the ring and gave them to Diane's office for the property inventory. And I put my own keys back on the ring. Apartment key, clinic key, car key. And the disc with JM caught the November light as I walked to my car on moving day with the 2 dogs and the last box of my things. And I held it for a moment before I unlocked the car. Just held it, the silver warm in my hand, my own initials in my own palm. I had never lost them. They had been on my keychain the whole time. I just hadn't been reading them.